Hi, good afternoon or good morning. Welcome to this Early Insights webinar series episode on hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. I'm Steve Pearson. I'm the president of ICER, and joining me for this webinar is Surya Singh, who's a senior advisor to ICER and former vice president and chief medical officer of specialty pharmacy at CVS. So these Early Insights webinar series, this is the third we've done, and their goal is to provide early insights into our ongoing ICER research. We've timed them to be done just after or shortly after the posting of our draft report. So it's important to remember that I will be speaking of draft report findings, but we know that many stakeholders, payers, policymakers, and others do pay attention to the draft report because it informs them in an earlier phase when they are starting to think about the evidence themselves. We have one more upcoming webinar currently scheduled on new treatments for asthma. That will be done on October 6th. We will be deciding about whether to do further public webinars, but the overall long-term goal is for these Early Insights webinars to become a core part of our subscription to the ICER Analytics platform, about which we'll be talking today as well. So, our vision for ICER Analytics as a platform is it's a new cloud-based platform that facilitates the use of our reports and the underlying analyses by all decision makers. And that means that it can serve a variety of different goals and purposes. It can help those who are developing their benefit design, so plan sponsors even, as well as insurance plans. It can help design formularies by informing the decisions around tiering and around prior auth. It can certainly help life science companies as they are planning the early phases of drug development and the clinical trials that are needed. And it's really also very much intended to serve as a common platform through which all policymakers, patient groups, clinicians, and others can also contribute to determinations of drug pricing and of the negotiations that go into drug reimbursement. So that's the goal for ICER Analytics. And these Early Insight webinars are meant, again, to give you an early peek, if you will, into some of our thinking about the evidence and to demonstrate some of the ability of ICER Analytics to help you use our reports in new and hopefully more kind of constructive, influential ways. On all of these efforts, we'd like to thank Formulary Decisions, which is our webinar host today, because they're helping to coordinate this series. Formulary Decisions is a secure third-party platform that facilitates the exchange of information between life science companies and payers to help support medical policy and formulary development. They have over 2,500 registered active healthcare decision makers from managed care organizations, pharmacy benefit managers, health systems, and government, representing over 900 organizations that make up this exclusive user community. And among its benefits of Formulary Decisions, the platform allows for seamless access to ICER Analytics. So let me move forward then into the drug value assessment overview. And again, this one is largely focused on Mavicampton, which is a drug in the pipeline for hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. I'm going to be talking about the evidence for effectiveness and value. So first off, hypertrophic cardiomyopathy may or may not be a clinical condition familiar to you, but it's not that uncommon. It has gone by different names over the past. It used to be called only hypertrophic obstructive cardiomyopathy, and that's considered to be a subset of the broader HCM population now. The estimates of how many patients it affects is quite wide because diagnosis is not very consistent. But somewhere between 600,000 to 1.5 million Americans have HCM. And just to benchmark this is more than the number of patients in the country with multiple sclerosis. The condition is marked by a very diverse set of phenotypes, different kinds of situations in which patients will present. But the basic underlying kind of structural, even genetic abnormality is one that leads to excessive contraction of the heart muscle, which causes the walls of the heart to thicken over time and in many cases to become stiff. That leads to symptoms that can include a wide variety of different things like chest pain and shortness of breath with exertion. Some patients will just have generalized fatigue, And over again, the wide diversity of patients, there's an increased risk of atrial fibrillation, heart failure, and even stroke and sudden cardiac death. Now, there are clinical guidelines for the treatment of HCM, and their most recent iteration was published just a year ago in 2020. The first line of treatment is beta blockers and calcium channel blockers, again, to try to slow down and to relax, if you will, the contraction force in the heart. If that's not successful, the second line has traditionally been a drug called disopyramide, or a surgical or other kind of invasive approach to, it's called septal reduction procedure, or SRP. And these really come in two main varieties. One is a percutaneous alcohol septal ablation, and the other is a more open surgical myectomy, in which the heart muscle itself is kind of carved down. For patients who are viewed to be high risk for sudden death, they are often treated these days with an implantable cardio defibrillator as well. So Mavicampton is an oral drug. It's a first-in-class modulator of cardiac myosin. And right now the PDUFA date is January 28th, 2022. So in our review, we looked at the evidence on Mavicampton as well as the evidence on disopyramide and on the two procedures I mentioned, percutaneous alcohol septal ablation and surgical myectomy. Just to note, there are ongoing trials right now evaluating the drug Entresto in that population of patients with HCM who do not have obstructive outflow patterns. All right, so the data for Mavicampton, again, it's focused primarily on the pivotal trial called Explorer, which was a randomized controlled trial of 251 patients. The main outcome was at 30 weeks. It was a composite outcome, which makes things somewhat challenging, but it was a composite outcome of improvement in a physiological parameter, which is the peak VO2, and the clinician-defined symptom improvement in New York Heart Association class for heart failure. This composite outcome was achieved by 37% of patients in the Mavicampton arm at 30 weeks, compared to 17% in the placebo arm. Patient-reported outcomes were also included, including a quality of life scale, and they were concordant with this composite primary outcome. So the change in the KCCQ, that's one of these quality of life measures, was greater with Mavicampton than with placebo. If you can see below, in the table below, we've really just focused here on the Heart Association heart failure class. And just to give you a flavor again for the benefits seen with Mavicampton, I'll highlight this one class here. So class 1 is the mildest symptoms or no symptoms. And you can see at baseline, no patients in either the placebo or Mavicampton arm were in class 1. And after 30 weeks, 50% of patients had moved into that class, meaning that they were improved from their distribution in worse heart failure classes. 21% of patients in the placebo arm had improved into that class. So fairly substantial, if you will, changes into better heart failure status. Let's shift to disopyramide. Here we really do not have randomized trials. In this patient population, we have a fairly high quality retrospective study that did a meta-analysis, and it was the most authoritative study we had. Among those in this meta-analysis who stayed on disopyramide, the mean peak flow gradient, and that's one measure again of how obstructive the process is in the heart, it decreased from 75 millimeters of mercury at baseline to 40. And the mean heart failure class declined, which means it got better, from 2.3 to 1.7. Of the 118 patients in this kind of overall set that were treated with disopyramide, 40 of them, so a fairly high number, did go on to require major interventions, and at a mean of about 2 years after initiating drug treatment. So it's not a kind of start this drug and kind of continue on forever for for a lot of patients. It's still a fairly high percentage end up needing or deciding to get a procedure. And among those who did require an intervention, disopyramide was not associated with improvements in their heart failure class and only modest improvements in the peak gradient, which makes sense. LVOT stands for left ventricular outflow tract gradient. All right, so let's talk now about the septal reduction therapies. This was a systematic literature review and meta-analysis. Right? So here we're looking at pooled mean improvements in heart failure class before and after treatment. So things got better. Their heart failure class improved, if you will, 1.16 for septal ablation, 1.51 for myectomy. And there were very large reductions relatively to the drug treatments in median outflow tract gradients. 71% reduction for septal ablation, 77% for myectomy. The harms of the two drugs, Mavicampton, in the trials we have so far, the Explorer trial, is generally well tolerated. There are some findings in which there have been excessive drops in the left ventricular ejection fraction, down to less than 50% in some of the patients treated. That returned to normal in all but one patient. And 1.6%, of which a relatively small number, obviously, discontinued Mavicampton in the trial. For disopyramid, the known harms include a risk of arrhythmia and prolonged QT interval, and discontinuation due to side effects is somewhat higher in the trials existing on that 7 to 23%. The harms of septal reduction therapies are interesting because they're obviously peri-procedural risks. We know less about the longer-term risks of these, but there are peri-procedural data that show, for instance, for septal ablation, the risk of a peri-procedural adverse arrhythmic event is 2.2%, for myectomy, 1%, and peri-procedural mortality is about 1.3% for septal ablation and 2.5% for myectomy. So this will come back as a consistent theme, this idea that septal ablation and myectomy, in some ways, their data suggest a bigger effect on the heart muscle and on the outflow tract gradients, and perhaps on New York Heart Association failure class. But the trade-off, if you will, among others, is a peri-procedural risk for adverse events and even mortality. So there are many uncertainties and controversies still in this data. There are no long-term data yet for Mavicampton, and there are no head-to-head trials of it versus disopyramid or the procedures. Clinical experts, top clinical experts, do disagree widely about some of the factors in these data. They disagree about the importance of the ejection fraction decreases associated with Mavicampton in terms of whether that's a very important or clinically significant finding, about whether if it's too much, or about whether there's a risk involved with that. They also will just disagree about the basic ideal role for Mavicampton in therapy. Should it be something that is viewed as the replacement for disopyramid, or as the next step after disopyramid, or as the first choice before anything? So there are widely differing views on what role it should play, and in part that's linked to the idea that patients will have very different ideas about their relative preference for surgical procedures as opposed to oral treatment. We still have limited efficacy evidence for disopyramid in this patient population. And as I've mentioned already, procedures versus medication involves a fundamental trade-off that is going to be heavily influenced by not only clinician preferences, perhaps, but certainly by patient preferences. So our evidence ratings here, draft evidence ratings, for Mavicampton plus usual care, remember that's that background beta blocker and calcium channel blocker. Mavicampton added to that, we rated promising but still inconclusive. This was due largely, again, to clinical expert input on the potential risks of some of the functional kind of signals seen with Mavicampton use, the lack of longer-term data on its benefits. For Mavicampton plus usual care versus disopyramid, we also said promising but inconclusive. This is largely because the benefits at least seem to be somewhat larger for Mavicampton. There's still some questions again about the safety aspects. And for Mavicampton plus usual care, we actually, versus septal reduction therapies, we actually chose to give no rating. This was to send as strong a signal as we could that the choice between these two, you can do some kind of qualitative judgment of the overall benefits and risks. And many patients and clinicians, or they should walk through those, but that the idea of that there being a single rating for that comparison, given how different patient kind of utilities or preferences will be for the stark differences between surgical approaches and the oral treatment here, we thought merited our not putting a rating on that. So potential other benefits outside, if you will, the clinical benefits to the patient and some contextual considerations. First, it is important to recognize that this Mavicampton is a new option that may help expand access to effective treatment for a variety of patients, given that the procedures are really only available at some specialized centers. So for patients in more rural or more kind of out of the way locations, having an oral option may be an important benefit of having Mavicampton available. The benefits of treatment with any of these approaches, however, may also extend beyond health effects, given that this condition can affect patients during their kind of younger adult lives when they are making educational choices, family choices, etc. So there is a kind of a spillover effect of health on longer term prospects in those choices. Another contextual consideration, perhaps, is that the health benefits that are measured for these treatments, they can be, and we're not even sure, overstated or understated somewhat when based solely on changes in New York Heart Association class. So that is the easiest single outcome to compare across these different treatments, but it certainly doesn't capture the potential harms and benefits of these treatments for patients with HCM. All right, let's jump to the economic cost effectiveness analysis side of our draft review. So in our model, we compared Mavicampton to that first line treatment alone, beta blockers and calcium channel blockers, to disopyramid, septal ablation, and to myectomy. The quality of life improvements across all of these treatments were driven by changes in the heart failure class. That is what the outcome that best translates through to quality of life. There was assumed to be no mortality difference. And again, this is somewhat controversial as an assumption. We certainly have no data to suggest that there is a mortality benefit, but some clinical experts will say that there likely is. Some will say that there may not be because management of this condition has been improved over the years, especially with implantable cardiodefibrilators. There is, however, that short-term periprocedural mortality that we felt was important to model. As far as the cost and the cost effectiveness modeling for Mavicampton, there is no price now in the market. Therefore, we assumed a $75,000 per year price, which is based on publicly available analyst estimates. So let's jump right to the base case results for Mavicampton. And here you've got it versus these different comparators that I mentioned. The third column is the cost per quality adjusted life year or equal value life year gained. Those results are the same in this case because there is no mortality benefit to treatment. And as you can see, the Mavicampton versus standard treatment has a very high cost per quality and equal value life year gain of 1.2 million. Versus disopyramid, it's 1.5 million. And dominated means that myectomy and septal ablation were found to be both more effective and less expensive over the lifetime horizon. If you do a draft price threshold analysis based again on the draft results of the model, you can see those prices that are needed to meet a threshold at different cost effectiveness levels, 50,000 for quality or equal value life year gained, 100,000, 150,000, and 200,000. ICER will usually report out the 100 to 150,000 range, and here that would be somewhere between about 12,500 to about 15,500 as an annual price. And if you can remember right now at least, there is no price in the market. Analysts have predicted a price of $75,000 per year. As with all cost effectiveness analyses, we performed many sensitivity analyses and scenario analyses, either changing individual assumptions or inputs into the model or broader ones. What we found was that the key drivers of the model findings are not that surprising in this case. One is the quality of life estimates for each class of heart failure. These are relatively well established in the literature, but still different assumptions because the main effective treatment is on improving that New that New York Heart Association class. If you change those estimates of how the quality of life lines up with those classes, you will get notably different cost effectiveness results. And then obviously the relative effect itself of Mavicampton and its price are likely to be very important and are. So the bottom lines here around the clinical and cost effectiveness in this draft review for Mavicampton. We have a good randomized trial, Explorer, and it does demonstrate that Mavicampton improves exertional symptoms and quality of life in patients with symptomatic hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. Good findings over the short term. However, as I've noted, clinical experts have had starkly contrasting interpretations of some of the functional effects seen in that same study. Some experts really worry that the reduction in left ventricular ejection fraction and the muscle thickness that is seen could lead to long-term harms rather than benefits. Now, whether Mavicampton will be viewed as a replacement for disopyramid or septal reduction therapies will be very dependent upon clinicians and will likely vary a lot across the country, assuming that the drug is approved. And a large part of that variation, again, will be driven by local practice patterns, and a lot of it will be driven and should be driven by patient preferences, because there are going to be very important differences in the way that people weigh their risks and trade-offs of benefits between taking a pill versus a procedural approach that may have a longer established track record, but definitely has a short-term risk that the pills do not. And lastly, at a placeholder annual price right now, $75,000 per year, adding treatment with Mavicampton to the first-line treatment that we have available does not appear cost-effective. All right, now I encourage you to watch closely as our report evolves between draft to evidence report and then on to the public meeting and our final report. But that's where things stand as of today. Now, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Surya Singh, who is going to walk you through a mock-up of how this kind of information is made available in the ICER Analytics platform, and hopefully give you, again, a deeper feeling for how, if you like ICER reports and you like many of the perspectives that you find there, how we think ICER Analytics can help you get that more quickly and allow you to do new things with it. So Surya, let me hand it over to you.
Great, thank you, Steve. So I am going to start this portion of the webinar with a little bit of an overview of the ICER Analytics platform. What you see first represented here on the screen is the two halves of the ICER Analytics platform, and I'm actually going to go through both of them. I'll spend a disproportionate amount of the time that I have on the interactive modeler portion, but I'll start with the evidence compendium represented here on the left-hand side. And just in this entry screen, you'll see that with access to the platform, you can go directly to either side of what I'm going to demonstrate for you. But I'll take you first, like I said, to the evidence compendium. And in the spirit of a early access or early insights webinar, you won't find Mavicampton on this list yet. But what you're looking at is what you might immediately visually look at and say, it looks like an online scrollable spreadsheet. It's cloud-based, and it has a list by row here of different agents, different drugs that ICER has reviewed, either in individual reports or as part of multi-drug or class level reviews. So you can navigate through this, you can scroll it, you can select them, you can search by keyword. So since we're talking about cardiovascular today, I'm gonna go with a recent ICER report, search cholesterol, and you'll see the recent report that had inclisiran and Nexletol in it. And once I've searched for what I'd like to examine, I can do a couple of different things in the ICER evidence compendium portion of this platform. The first, if you look up here at the tabs, there are 4 of them, and I'll go through each of them quickly, is the drug list that I just showed you. So that's the overall compendium, the entire list. there's the compendium pricing tab. So let's go there now. And I've pre-selected a couple of the drugs on that list from my search for cholesterol agents. And for those two drugs, I can input a price that I want to examine against the cost effectiveness thresholds, okay? So back to the example for Mavicampton, we don't have a price yet because the drug is not yet available domestically. And so there's a aspect of this could be used in forecasting. But I think the primary use case for this, if you will, is when the process is unfolding for either formulary development or comparison of what the net cost could be under different preferred and non-preferred arrangements in custom or template formulary. So I've pre-populated these two fields with $5,000 for a net price annually and $7,000 for net price annually. And you can see these discounts from that price that are needed to reach the cost-effective threshold in each of these columns, right? At different dollar per unit benefit, either quality adjusted life year or equal value life year gained. And each of these columns has a different value. There's a visualized comparison of that, so you can see within the range of $100,000 per quality adjusted life year in the green to $150,000 per quality adjusted life year. Where does that price that I entered fall? Is it in or is it out of the cost-effective range? I can toggle the perspective that I'm taking between health system and societal. We'll circle back to that in the interactive modeler demonstration. And I can change whether I'm looking in the denominator of this at a different unit of benefit. In this case, as you know, in ICER reports, equal value life year gained is available wherever possible. So I'll be very brief on this next tab. The ICER pricing tab gives you a more detailed look at the figures that you can find in the evidence report that many of you are familiar with, but a summarized view that, again, like the prior tab, which I didn't mention explicitly, but I will here, it's available on both, can download a comma-separated value file that can be imported into your program of choice, most likely Excel, but you can put that CSV file into another program for further manipulation. And then lastly, I'm going to show you this report snapshots with inclisiran. So when I click on that, I get a series of different materials that are organized by first this set of documents, some of which are already produced that you're familiar with from the ICER website, or some of you are. The presentation slides, the report at a glance and a summarized view of the findings, the summary of the evidence, a summary of the patient perspectives portion of the evidence report, and then recommendations for fair pricing and fair access, which if you've been keeping up to date with ICER's most recent white papers, you're familiar with what this area is, but another important document related to each of the new areas being reviewed. On the left over here, you have a key takeaways video that's roughly 12 to 15 minutes in length that's recorded either by Steve or by ICER's Chief Medical Officer, David Rind, specifically for the ICER evidence compendium summarizing all the materials. So instead of pouring through the different pieces of this, you can take that relatively short amount of time and get the highlights. Over on the right, in video format again, are several different pieces from the public meeting, including the evidence presentation that you can view just through those thumbnails. So with that, I'm going to head over to the other half. You remember back to that first screen of the ICER Analytics platform, and that is called the Interactive Modeler. So now we're back in the world of thinking about a specific drug. We were just in the, sort of straddling between the overall view, all things that ICER's reviewed in the recent past, a specific category that I searched for, and then drilling down the report snapshot in a particular drug. But now, which I think is a different perspective to take, we're opening up the box and saying, okay, we're inside the model now that was used to produce these results. Let's look at how we can make changes to the actual inputs and assumptions inside the model. Okay, so the intervention here is labeled Mavicampton. And I'll take the opportunity to say you'll see a few different places in this where we've put the specific language. Obviously, this is the, titled as the Hypertrophic Cardiomyopathy model in the interactive modeler. But what's really important for me to emphasize at the outset here is this draft. So again, back to the spirit of this, as an early insights webinar, this is early. The model is not finalized in the ICER analytics platform. This is not actually, in many cases, reflective of inputs that are in the actual model. I'll point those out and make comments about where other inputs will show up from an organizational and structural perspective as I go through this. But this is not at all meant to represent what a final or even a near final Mavicampton model in their interactive modeler is going to look like. This is meant to show you the functionality of the interactive modeler and really be able to talk through where many of the findings that Steve just presented will fall in as the default values, and where changes as real world evidence or other updates those values come out, or data that you have access to as an organization in your own organizations can be put in, can be inputted into this structure and into the ICER model. Okay, so with that bit of a disclaimer around this, I'm going to just walk you through the organization of it first. So on the left-hand side, I've got a series of inputs, and on the right-hand side, a series of outputs. The inputs are organized into these 6 different categories, which I'll walk through, and the outputs into budget impact outputs and cost effectiveness outputs. Okay, and then there are a few things on the right that I'll cover at the end. So in terms of the inputs, the settings is where you'll find the sort of big, quote unquote, global settings for each model. And so since each model is different and nuanced and specific to that domain and what was reviewed, there will be some changes. There will be some differences between models here, but as an overall structure, you'll find the perspective each time between health system and modified societal, again, which Steve mentioned briefly, and that I know many people watching this are familiar with from ICER's reports. So you can change the perspective here if you want to include all of the societal inputs and caregiver impact and so on. I'm going to leave it as health system. And then there's the discount rate and budget impact threshold on a PM basis here that are modifiable fields. The epidemiology is next. It's very skinny right now. There's only 2 fields, but you can imagine that when the whole entire model for Mavicampton is in, there will be other fields added to be able to give characteristics of the specific population. But these are common ones that you'll find in virtually every model. So the average age of the population, the proportion female. I actually put in the percentage female from the Explorer trial in this field. And I'll take that opportunity as a launching off point to say all of these fields are pre-populated with the values that were used in the model version that's in the evidence report, that's represented in the results that are in the evidence report. So, rest assured that if there's something that you're not sure what to do with, it's not like you're starting with a blank slate here. You're starting with the default values that the expert team at ICER, after reviewing all of the available evidence, have put in. And so only when there's really an impetus because of data that you have, as I mentioned before, something new that's come out that's publicly available or that was shared with you, would you go in and make changes to it. And we'll get to how this can be used to assist in the forecasting process when we get to the end of the inputs here in the budget impact modeling section. But so that's the epidemiologic section, but you can imagine could be other population characteristics in terms of New York's, percentages of patients in different New York Heart Association classification breakdown and so on. Clinical, the percent with the, the primary outcome, and then the actual effectiveness of the intervention. These are obviously generic terms because, again, these is not updated for the Mavicampton model yet, but this is where you would find the primary outcome that was examined in Explorer, and that the results are predicated upon for this analysis in terms of the class reduction for New York Heart Association classification, and then the VO2. So clinical inputs will be listed here. Anything over here in the input fields in white can be modified, so you can make modifications. And that brings me over to the quality of life tab, where you'll find the utilities of each state. And then, of course, the scales that were talked about actually could be between, depending on the model, between the clinical and the quality of life sections. The KCCQ that Steve mentioned, also in the report, you'll see the HCMSQ, shortness of breath, SOB scale. Those quality of life assessments and what the inputs are for the model can be modified in this tab typically, although depending on how they were used, they could also reside in clinical. Importantly, on the cost tab, you'll find a lot of different things. In this case, again, because it's a draft, you see there's just a unit cost. It's labeled Mavicampton. There's not a price in the market. Analysts have figures that are much higher than this projected annual cost. So I'm not going to, try to put any kind of projection here, but I'll just show you. You can, change that figure and see that things dynamically, the outputs dynamically update on the right. The number of administrations for the drug is listed here. Oral, and in the trials dosed at typically 5 milligrams, 5 to 50 milligrams a day. But the list will be much longer again, and will be when this model is finalized. So the comparators, the cost of the comparators, pyramid, and then the septal ablation and myectomy procedures. This is also where medical cost offsets, when those are important to a model, like in this case, any of the other downstream procedural considerations, things that patients would get in addition to or in place of the drug, as I just mentioned, those three different treatment options will be listed here so that the cost can be put into the model. Lastly, in terms of inputs, is the one that will take the longest. So the budget impact modeling, BIM. So you start off with a funnel that I know many people are familiar with some kind of representation in a budget impact model like this. But just to walk through it, and I'm going to change the outputs here to the budget impact outputs. Starting at the top, you specify the size of the population. Okay, so we started with 1 million. Let's just, so you can see the numbers changing there in the background, change to 2.5 million. Okay, and you see the figures all change in the background here. The disease prevalence for hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, 0.2%. But importantly, how many of those patients have been diagnosed, right? So you can use this slider or input a value and say it's 60%. You can say, oh, we're a little bit better. We have a center of excellence. More people are diagnosed. So the figure here, update again, it's 65%. And then assume whatever percentage as appropriate here in your network for how many people and with your management approach would be eligible for treatment. Okay, is it all of those diagnosed patients? Is there a cut point? Is there an estimate of that? It's different. I'm going to leave it at 100% of those diagnosed here. Now comes the part that we're very excited about, and then I will, after making a couple adjustments here for you, walk you through the way that these outputs come out. But that's this detailed BIM budget impact model input section. Okay, so we start off here. It's another sort of nested set of tabs inside this section, this pop-up. And there's a intervention uptake is the first one in the first tab. So your first choice, and we have defaults here again for this. So again, you change only the things that are necessary for the exercise you're going through, but let me just show you what's there. You can assume that there's linear market uptake or that there's a custom uptake. So it's not just going up by 20% per year through the 5 years that we're estimating or forecasting here. You can also change the time horizon from 5 years. I'm going to leave it at 5 years for now. I'm also going to leave it at linear, but you see how those input fields appear. And then I get into the comparators. So I've pre-checked these for disopyramide, septal ablation, and myectomy. And knowing that there's this much talked about shortage in the long-term version of disopyramide, resulting in fewer patients being on it right now, made a very low estimate of how many patients are on it for purposes of demonstration, and just mirrored that for the procedures here. Okay, so now I've said that all of these treatment options are being included in this budget impact model, and now I get to the what does the market basket look like? Okay, so we're going out 5 years, and we have the Mavicampton line, the disopyramide line or row, and then the septal ablation and myectomy rows. I can go through this matrix, and you can see it can get quite detailed and complex. Change these figures for what I believe the actual distribution will be in each of the upcoming out years, the forecasted years, across these different options. And then you see a visualization of that below, right? So there's a lot of flexibility on this to be able to change, as I did here, to make it nonlinear, if you're assuming that some of the patients, as Steve went through in the presentation, did get treated with drug, with the intervention with Mavicampton, but they went on to get a procedure anyway. Some hypertrophy occurred, there's some outflow attractive such, whatever the case may be, that led to, during these forecasted years for this cohort that we're tracking over time, getting a procedure down the road. Okay. Now I've got this prices tab, and there's a lot to show here. I'm going to be pretty focused in what I'll go into detail on. There's the annual treatment costs. Again, that if you want to change the cost, you would do that in the cost tab, just in terms of keeping some hygiene in the structure of this and where the inputs go. These are reflective of the changes you would have made in the cost tab. You can change the discounts by year instead of just having one set of assumptions. So if that's a dynamic for the way that you're modeling this and forecasting it, that's important too. And then I've got this cost sharing tab. So I can actually set up, based on my benefit design, what the coinsurance and copay rates are by tier, and then assign each of the therapeutic options. Now, obviously, it's a little more complicated in this case because of the presence of procedures that are covered under the medical benefit versus oral agents. But we can put those agents into a coinsurance structure using this portion of the platform and the way it's been arranged. And there's the opportunity to be able to use this user-defined field rather to help with doing that. But it's really designed to try to help with optimizing that comparison in a benefit design between different agents that might fall into different tiers or even in the same tier, and be able to then do scenario analyses and look at what, when you change things to a different amount of coinsurance or a different copay, what happens, and just watch the figures in the background. You can see that it dynamically updates. You want to see that went from 780 to 680 million with a little more cost shifting here on the coinsurance side for the tier that Mavicampton is assigned to. So there's a lot there. I'm going to stop with this detailed budget impact model set of inputs, but hopefully you got a sense for how it's structured and how it can be used. And then just to close with two things. So the set of outputs here for budget impact, you can look at it as an average annual impact or over the years sequentially that are being forecasted. And then just going down here to the lower left, the number of patients affected with Mavicampton and the number of patients being followed with the comparators. The per patient per year cost, and again, that's with and without treatment, or the treatment of interest, Mavicampton, and then the PMPM expense. And you can look at that just for the treatment specific portion of it and the incremental expense on a PMPM basis. Then lastly, there are a few different things to look at here. I'll just point out one, that there's an executive summary that's reflective of all the changes, the choices you've made throughout, and dynamic, that shows the incremental outcomes impact, cost effectiveness, and the potential budget impact from that last set of outputs that I was demonstrating that can be, easily exported or snapshotted for use in other presentations. So one last thing. Once I've put in a bunch of inputs and made modifications that I'm happy with, or that I want to work from in the future, I can save those up here with the save button, and they'll reappear in this pull down for me. So I could, create in addition to the base scenarios 1, 2, 3, 4, and come back and work from those in the future. All right. So with that, thanks so much for sticking with us. I'm going to turn it back over to Steve for a couple last comments and to wrap up.
Great. Thank you very much, Surya. Thank you very much. All right. That was great. Okay, so I wanted to close just in a couple of notes. One is that this ICER analytics platform, we know that for any user, it's going to be hard to figure out by themselves, perhaps right off the bat, how to integrate it into their usual course of work, even if they're currently using ICER reports in a variety of different ways. So we have been doing recently what we call a white glove service, and it's available to all users from payers and life science companies. And it really means that we start with a very personalized orientation demo that's based off a topic or topics that you want to work on in terms of specific drugs or specific condition areas, and you have tried to use it or you want to use it there, and we really work with you to do it together. And that goes along with kind of, briefings with ICER leadership, myself, and Sarah Emond and others. And as you go through the first couple months of using the platform as part of a free trial in particular on that first month, we have coaching sessions to really make sure that we are available and that we actively help you as you learn how to make the most out of ICER analytics. And so we're finding this can be a very helpful way for people to get the feel of ICER analytics and to make their own decision, obviously, about whether they feel it can be a big addition to how they currently use ICER work. So we hope you've enjoyed this early insights webinar into Mavicampton and hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. As I mentioned, our next one is asthma on October 6th. And we want to thank you. To start your free trial on ICER analytics, all you have to do is to visit the website. There's the given right there, or you can just visit ICER.org and find it there on the home page as well. And any questions at all, feel free to contact analytics@ICER.org, and our Director of Strategic Partnerships will reach right back out to help answer your questions. So thank you very much. I hope you have a good rest of your day, and we'll look forward to our next Early Insights webinar next month. Bye-bye.